We are running a theme this year called Just Grace, Forgiveness and Accountability at Work. We're doing that at Faith in Business Monthly, which we've been doing over the past 5 months. This is the 5th in those sessions. And then we culminated our retreat at the end of April. And do go on our website and book in there if you haven't done so already. The theme today is Just Grace in Workplace Culture. So looking at things like leadership style, values, growth of organizations, how we treat our employees and our customers and suppliers. So it should be a really good and insightful session today. I'm really pleased to introduce to you our two speakers. The first one, which I'll just put on, so you can see him now, is Matt Parfitt, and our second speaker is Cara Martin. Matt, first of all, to introduce him, may well be familiar to a number of you in the UK. He's a serial social entrepreneur, and he has a vision for seeing the church re-enter the world of business, create opportunities and resources for the kingdom. Along with his church, he has a vision to create 7 different social enterprises, creating jobs for lots of people, and all sharing the same godly values and culture that he'll talk about soon. So far, he's created 3 social enterprises: Radiant Cleaners, Jubilee Events, and Half the Story. And if you haven't had their biscuits yet, then we encourage you to get them soon. These organizations are providing real jobs for people who have multiple barriers to work, pay everybody the real living wage, and provide holistic support both in and outside the workplace. Cara is going to be speaking to us all in a few minutes. She's one of our friends at the Mockler Centre. She, as she said earlier, is actually based in Australia, so we thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today so late in your evening. And she's a visiting fellow at the Mockler Centre and also adjunct professor with the Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. Last year, she won the Australian Faith and Work Award, and she's the author of 2 books around workship, along with podcasts and much other information. And that's all around the theme of how to use your work to worship God. She's recently published a 3rd book, which is called Keeping Faith: How Christian Organizations Can Stay True to the Way of Jesus. And she's going to be speaking to us a little bit about that now, after which she'll be interviewing Matt with a number of questions based around the book and her talk. Please do put your comments and questions in the chat, and we'll get to them once the interview with Matt has completed. So a great welcome to Cara and Matt and everybody else who's joined us. And Cara, we're going to hand over to you now.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Stephen. And it's wonderful to join you all. It's actually a year ago when I was with you with Faith in Business last time, talking about Sabbath. Slightly different subject this time. Let me share my slides. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today is from this book, Keeping Faith, because the 2 topics just overlap so well. And I hopefully will give you some ideas, although this book is primarily about Christian organizations. It's not necessarily just charities or Christian schools or those sort of organizations, or even churches, although it's all relevant. The sort of things I'm talking about will also be relevant for Christians who run their own business. So my husband and I run a little home maintenance business, for example, or possibly the opportunity to influence within whatever context you are. So in this book, basically our assumption was that it's the exception rather than the rule that that organizations can stay true to the way of Jesus. What we see is this bias, this tendency to become increasingly secular in an organization. George Marston and James Burchell, who did studies of Christian higher education in the US, talk about a vapid humanism that enters into organizations. And really what this is just reflecting is our own personal bias away from faith. So it really shouldn't come as a surprise. What is required is intentionality. We talk about some of the things. Most people go to the last chapter of the book because that's where we have a checklist of unfaithfulness. But these are some of the things. We have 14 things there. Here are some of the things that might impact on an organization being able to stay true. One is the allure of growth. Once you start growing, it's really hard to maintain a Christian culture across many sites or many different sorts of businesses. There's a real challenge there. Or it could be the seductive donor, that person who contributes to the organization, but because they contribute, they want to actually sway the organization a certain way. Sometimes that's helpful, and sometimes it can be a distraction from your mission. There's an area we call acquiescing to overreach, and that's when if you take money from the government, then the government tends to not just want to tell you how you should spend that money within your organization. They actually want to shape the culture of your organization as well, and that can impact on choices that you make. And the last one, in some ways, shouldn't be said, but in other ways, it needs to be. Do we allow enough time to actually spend time with God and reflect on Him in the different things that we do? And I think this is true for individuals in whatever workplace, as well as organizations as a whole, rather than sort of just perfunctory prayers. How much do we actually bring stuff before God and see ourselves working with God? We say that the antidote to this sway is to actually practice organizational faithfulness, which is not just about the mission front. You know, if you're a Christian school, you're thinking about education, how you do that. If you're a charity, you're thinking about what your charity is involved in. But it's actually turning the gaze, the theological and biblical gaze inwards as well to how the organization is run, all different parts of the organization. And really, it's wanting this consistency between what's seen from the outside. It's, reasonably easy to have a Christian veneer, but how much do we have a deeper sort of focus internally as well? So we talk about these 3 different areas that you need to focus on. The first one is identity. Identity is the who and why of the organization, who you are, your story, but also your mission, your purpose, what you're trying to achieve. That overlaps with the ethos or the spirit, or the subject of what we're talking about today, the workplace culture as well. It's all those relationships, values, aspirations, it's all of that. And that's the how you actually achieve things in your organization. And that overlaps with the impact and the outcome. And that's the what you do. It's the activities, but how you measure those activities and the impact. And one of the things that we're keen to ask people to do is to think about the spiritual impact or the kingdom impact of your organization and what you do. We suggest that what's good to do is develop an organizational theology statement. I don't have enough time to go into that now, but we'll have a look at what we do if we actually had an organizational theology of just grace. We'll get to that in a moment. But the sorts of elements that you might have in that sort of statement might be a theology of risk, a theology of generosity, of grace, of church collaboration, of inclusion, of good stewardship, of radical hospitality, of forgiveness, of a holistic approach of disciple making. Just some ideas of the sorts of things that you might include, but it would be good to make it really relevant to the heart and the context of what your organization is about. Now, as I said, this is not just about Christian organizations as we imagine them, schools or charities or other sorts of faith-based organizations. This is something you can do in a different context. So in the last year, I've had the pleasure of analyzing the organization Service Master, which is a US publicly listed company. At one stage, it was a Fortune 500 company started by Christians, had Christian leadership over a period of time. And in analyzing them, looking at their values and their culture and so on, these were the sorts of things I saw happening there, that they were honoring God in the marketplace. They had a theology of people development, a theology of servant leadership, a theology of stewardship, a theology of working together. Not everyone in the organization was a Christian, but I think it's still possible to develop a culture that expresses all of these things. And so I wanted to look at our topic today, this idea of just grace and what this might look like. The first thing I suggest you do is just think about a summary of biblical input. So what do we think about when we talk about just grace? I know there's already been a lot of input in the last sessions to this, but put simply, these were the sorts of things I was thinking was really important. We believe that God calls us to forgive others, whether or not the other acknowledges fault or apologizes, and there's plenty of biblical texts about that. God has demonstrated this through Jesus, who died for us while we were still sinners. We believe that full reconciliation involves both parties agreeing to work towards that. You'll see that's the subtle difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Ultimately, we know that God is sovereign and he will make all things right. God's grace is extended to all, not just believers, but everyone. And he is also a God of justice and expects us to follow his example. And of course, Micah 6:8 is brilliant for that, by acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God. Now, sometimes we just leave it at that biblical input and expect people to try and figure out, well, what does that look like where you work? But I think the really good thing to do is to translate that into some of the behaviors that we expect in a workplace. So these might be some of the behaviors that we'd like to see if we're looking at that, the implications. So we seek to be quick to forgive an offence against us while seeking justice for all. And when there is conflict, we will work towards full reconciliation where both parties are committed. You'll notice there it's reliant on both parties being committed to it. We will model God's gracious activity toward us by being generous towards others. We will be transparent about mistakes and failures with a desire to learn from them. Just as an aside, just thinking about several of the very public failures of Christian organizations in recent years, that transparency is often a thing that is missing. And we will act beyond policies to be a place where our employees and clients or customers can flourish. This idea that we have policies, but grace sometimes asks us to act beyond them to actually benefit others. So I had 6 minutes. I know that's a real dump load on everybody, but hopefully that stimulated some thoughts and ideas. I'll stop sharing now because I want to move to a bit of a chat with Matt about what this might look like. Matt has this fantastic business where grace is actually in the title. And so, Matt, I guess grace sums up your identity, the who and why, and it also sums up your culture, I assume, because it's right there, and it sums up the sort of impact that you want to have. Is that a heavy responsibility for you to bear?
Yeah, so for those that don't know, Grace Enterprises is all about creating life-changing jobs for people who have been homeless or in prison or refugees or struggle with addiction, basically major barriers to work, and believing that we can do that through business and actually employing those people, and but also supporting them holistically. And so, yeah, it's definitely that enterprising bit, the business bit, and the Grace bit, not just because I go to Grace Church, but because of what we're trying to do and how we do it. And I think in some ways it is a heavy responsibility because we're working with some of the most vulnerable people, and there's a huge power imbalance, and we're giving people a job that otherwise wouldn't have a job and they haven't got any other options. But actually, and we are working with people, let's be honest, that others don't want to employ, and that is generally for a reason. So it's not easy, and there's all kinds of barriers that people are not free from, and addiction and other things just have their claws in people. And It's not as if we are working with people when everything's perfect. But I think for me, it does come down to not how much grace have I got left for someone from within, but actually looking at what Jesus has done for me on the cross. And then like I'm never going to outgrace that. So like we try and we try and get anywhere near. So we try to demonstrate grace as much as we can and just remember how much we've been forgiven while still trying to
Mm.
do it as a business. So there's a real tension in there.
Yeah, yeah. I want to explore that tension a little bit later, but can you just give us a couple of stories about what this looks like in terms of your workplace culture to practice this sort of grace?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like one of our employees is a guy called Anthony. He's been on a few videos. You might have seen him around, but actually, he would tell you that what's changed his life is not the fact that he came to church, is not the fact that he got a job, it's not the money. It was the support he had when he had a relapse while working for us. So,
Mm.
where he's had jobs before and then lost them. The amazing thing for him was not getting a job, it was keeping a job. And that when he in this case was like struggling with drugs, that we did discipline him. We went through the process with him. We actually were looking at how can we support you? How can we get out of this together? How can we bring you through? And I think just not sacking him, like when you go to your employer and you are not turning up for work because of drugs, you expect to be sacked. So I think from that point of view, it was that demonstration of grace initially, but then like the long, hard walk of demonstrating grace time and time again. But he's an amazing testimony of like actually now working for us, and it's just really great. It's alongside the church, but there's a lot going on. Another employee where it didn't work out as well was actually caught literally on camera stealing from one of our customers. In this case, it was actually alcohol. But and so what we were saying was, look, you can't continue to work in this. This was the cleaning business. We can't put you back out there because we can't trust you. That is broken right now. But we actually want to help support you, and then offered him a job within the Grace Enterprises, but actually in packing biscuits, somewhere where instead of putting him out there with temptation and with unreliability potentially and untrustworthiness, but somewhere where we could actually manage him and saying, so that was that mixture of like justice and saying, look, this can't carry on, while at the same time saying, but that we can turn a page and start a new chapter in one of our other businesses.
Yeah. What I love about those stories is grace is sometimes expressed in Christian organizations as being nice, but actually you're talking about the toughness of grace, yeah, of actually forgiving and setting boundaries and then stepping through and doing the hard work. And you haven't avoided conflict and you've been really transparent. And I think those elements are really, really important in it. One of the things I talked about, the risk of unfaithfulness, is this allure of growth. And you are a growing organization. Can you tell us, like, what are some of the concrete steps you're taking to maintain that gracious culture across the organization as it grows?
Yeah, there is a temptation like now when our stocks are relatively high and people like us. So it's lots of offers. We could partner with them or someone else and non-Christians and could end up getting bigger. And wouldn't that be nice and shiny? But actually sticking to what is it that makes us special? What is the saltiness? And it's not us, like it's the Holy Spirit, it's God. And so like if we run a huge risk diluting that because it's just not gonna work, it won't be the same. And even if it did somehow, it's like, what's the point? Like the reason we do what we do is because God's called us to it and it's making a difference. So yeah, there's that. But I mean, I think that what we're doing about that is actually we've got trustees in the sort of Grace Enterprises. And so we are looking, as things are going and going fairly well, we're looking at tightening our faith distinctives. So actually having conversations with like solicitors of like, what could we do? What can we do? What can't we do? Got to be careful because of employment law. And I'm not saying that a cleaning business is going to only hire Christians, not at all. We see it as part of our witness to hire people of all faiths and none. But actually, in our office team, in Grace Enterprises team, in the trustees, in the sort of executive team, we absolutely want to keep the fact that we're praying together and like seeking God for things and making decisions that aren't necessarily logical. So trying to tighten those rather than being just another organization that started Christian and got bigger and became dilute. We want to do the opposite, like actually to dig into it. Like this is what's got us here. We actually like are really confident in who we are and who God is. So let's get it enshrined so that if I go under a bus, things carry on and don't change, don't take a turn for the worse.
Reese has mentioned that the danger is that you keep it small so that you don't lose that theological foundation or that understanding. What growth obviously means helping more people. So, is there a way of working that out of being able to know how fast we could grow or what we should do, or is that just a discernment process? Mm.
Yeah, and I'm grateful that it's not me making a decision on my own for these kinds of things. So, I mean, it was initially, it was me, but then it's like actually a team of us and having a team of supportive trustees around so we don't make quick or rash decisions. And I think that's a question that all of us would have to wrestle with. If you could do 10 times more than you're currently doing, would that, but actually it would be less distinctive. You'd have less actual impact. Do you go for breadth or depth, or is it possible to have both? And so chuck in the spiritual element of that is like, would it be good to give out more food parcels to 1 million people, or would it be better to address the root of why people are in food poverty in the first place? And so, yeah, it is something we're not saying we don't want to get big, but we are saying we don't want to lose our saltiness because we
Mm.
know how that ends. So therefore, we think there's enough, like God's big enough that if he wants us to be big, then we will be, but let's definitely be distinctive and see where he
Mm.
takes us.
That's great. You mentioned before the tensions, and some of the tensions come up with interactions with others, interactions with churches and within the community and other organizations and so on. Have there been moments where it's been hard to maintain grace?
Oh, all the time. Like, I don't know about you lot. I'm not naturally gracious. Like, I find it very difficult to be gracious and think, oh, why am I bothering? But yeah, so when you've got customers paying you late, like you're literally an overdraft facility for a massive company when we're paying people who are really hard to employ. Like, what are you doing? And or when you've got like churches that have said, actually, we've decided that we found a slightly cheaper cleaning company that doesn't pay the real living wage. I mean, are you having a joke? Like it's ridiculous. So like trying to be gracious in those moments when realizing, of course, they'll be have budgetary pressures and they've got other things that are their priorities. And while at the same time, I gave up my whole career for this. Sam gave up being a GP for this. It's like pay us 50p more, like get on with it and actually make a difference with your spending. So yeah, I don't find it easy to be gracious, to be honest. But thankfully, God's got more grace for me than I have for others.
And I think what's nice there is that this we're calling this just grace. So there's that justice element as well. Yeah, that actually it's reasonable what you're asking for. Yeah. So you have to have those difficult conversations sometimes, don't you? Mm.
Yeah, and I'm sure we're not reasonable all the time. And yeah, but I could tell, when we've got, if you're in Cambridge in a couple of months' time, I'll tell you some stories over a glass of wine later in the evening that can't go on this call.
Awesome. That's a shout out to the retreat coming up, by the way. Um, yeah, by the way, people, we might be able to have time for a couple of questions. So please put them in the chat if you've got some questions. But I want to ask you one more, Matt. Your tagline is life-changing jobs. Can you give us an example of what that looks like in concrete terms? Mm.
Yeah, the most memorable or the most humbling one would be there was a lady we still do employ her, and she said to me, Matt, thank you so much for not sacking me when you could have done, and which was quite astute of her, really, to actually reflect like that because she's right. I could have sacked her loads of times. It was really frustrating. And I was thinking, why are we bothering? But actually, she was saying, but thank you for not sacking me because this job is the only thing that kept me going. That actually everything else around her was falling apart. And she was saying, look, I would have ended it all if it wasn't for this job. And so when I'm thinking about what's happened to her, knowing her backstory and the abuse she experienced as a child, had a girl the same sort of age, and thinking, yeah, actually, I cannot relate to what you've been through. And I can't, my daughter is like, it's 1 million miles from her existence. But actually, knowing that we have forgiven you and demonstrated grace when most others wouldn't and gone above and beyond. But like I said at the very beginning, it's so much less than what Jesus has done for me. And that's really humbling to know that she is now still alive, for one. So life changing, life saving. But actually, that also she's now become a grandmother and her life doesn't look perfect. But yeah, it is really amazing to see the difference it can make in like one individual and then a family and a community and just going out of our way a bit, or even sometimes a lot and repeatedly, really is worth it.
It's beautiful, Matt. It's so inspiring. And there's a lovely story in the chat as well, I think from Uganda, about the difference picking a young man in school, offering a space to come and learn mechanics. That person is still a great mechanic and still in school. That's just a great story. Yeah. Um, I will ask one more question because people haven't put enough questions in. So, one of my theories is that when we act in grace, it's not just the effect or the impact of that on another person, as you've beautifully described, but also there's something that changes within us. There's something that's formed within us. I wonder what that looks like within an organization trying to practice grace. Have you noticed that formational aspect as you've been gracious to others?
It's definitely an impact on me, and I can think of various moments over the quite a lot of years now where it's gone from sort of I could talk a good game about grace, but do I really believe it and do I really live it out? And then actually those times where I've been laying a lawn at 10 o'clock at night on a boiling hot summer's day, and the reason I'm there is because people haven't turned up for work earlier on, and I've missed children's bedtime and I've missed playing football. I'm thinking, what am I doing? Like I had a proper job before I did this, and I've given it up for other people, and now they've not even turned up. It's like this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I think then you're sort of really doing those sort of long, hard hours when no one's noticing, has really made a difference for me. So rather than when people like what we do and are noticing, I feel like I'm still doing the same thing I was 17 years ago when nobody cared, to be quite honest, and no one noticed, and that was fine. So I think there's definitely something foundational in there. And then through, yeah, so just a long, hard walk in the same direction, I think really makes a massive difference. And for as an organization, like, yeah, trying to develop leaders and trusting people and giving them the freedom to really go for it. And then covering them when they get it wrong, I find quite difficult, to be honest, because I'm like, oh, I think I probably could have done that better, or maybe you should have done it. But actually, it's the only way for an organization to be sustainable. And also, all I don't quite keep the same count of all the things that they've done so much better than me, and all the things that are loads they've improved as well. And so I love actually, it's difficult, but actually giving people freedom and seeing them thrive, and it works well when you find people that are better than you at stuff. So that's been a real joy. But trusting others and taking time off as well, like just actually not thinking the world revolves around me. So whether that's a Sabbath or a sabbatical or just trusting others, and just knowing that, yeah, I don't have a monopoly on grace or good ideas, but actually trusting other people, trusting the trustees, holding other things and being part of a process where naturally I'd want to be reactive and an entrepreneur, and actually tied myself down to working with others. But actually so much, it's a cliche to say you want to go fast, go on your own, you want to go far, go together, but it really has been true, and I'm sure they've saved me from countless mistakes along the way. So it's
It's one of the challenges actually as an entrepreneur to move from that sort of starting things to actually making something sustainable long term. That's great that you've been able to do that transition. Many founders don't. I wonder if you have a comment. Reese has said has talked about what he calls a spiritual caste system, but that idea of full-time ministry, but then others are tent makers. You've actually come across this, haven't you? I know. In thinking about that difference between ministry and working in business. Any comments on that and your interactions with church, the appreciation of the churches that you've worked with for what you're trying to do, and the value of just ordinary work?
Yeah, and like obviously on a call like this is not going to be a balanced argument, is it? Where we're all going to be saying absolutely the church should be doing more. Like I was a teacher, Sam was a doctor, and they're probably regarded as like being great, sort of caring professions and doing good, and there's no money involved, so you can't possibly get it wrong from that point of view, can you? But actually, and business is always got to be done, and someone needs to make some money, and then they can give it to the church and trust the church to spend it well. And all of us on this call, I guess, would take a very different attitude towards that. And I know Reese and like faith-driven entrepreneur and those kind of things where actually there is such an opportunity to be out there in the marketplace. The reason I stopped teaching to start gardening in that case was because I wanted to spend more time with people out in the world doing real stuff and being relevant. And I think that that's something that business can do that alongside the church. I'm passionate about the two together, but yeah, I
Mhm.
certainly um, if my children were saying they wanted to become a missionary or a church leader to follow Jesus more effectively, I would have quite a lot to say. And hopefully, I don't think there's any danger of that anyway, but it would be, yeah, I think we're preaching to the converted here. You should get Reese on because he would definitely agree.